Good morning, everyone. My name's Sheridan Misso, and as Annie mentioned, I'm the Vice President of the CCAV, and it's my pleasure to be introducing Doris Zagdanski to speak with us today as our keynote speaker. So a little bit about Doris. Doris has worked in the field of grief education and support for grieving people for almost 40 years. Much of this time has been spent employed in and around the funeral industry, in roles such as National Training Manager and General Manager of Queensland Funerals for InvoCare, from where she retired in 2021 after a 27-year career. Doris is the author of 7 books on themes around loss, grief and empathy, subjects which she speaks about with passion and authority. She ties this in with a strong focus on the areas of customer service, communication skills and business success. She is considered to be a thought leader in her field and has worked across Australia and New Zealand as an organisational trainer and conference speaker. Her extensive client list includes Queensland Police Service, Lifeline Gold Coast, Australian Federation of Civil Celebrants, Palliative Care Victoria, Griffith University Queensland, Australian Funeral Directors Association, Queensland Fire and Emergency Services, Ronald McDonald House, Centennial Park Adelaide, and the Australasian Cemeteries and Crematoria Association, and many more. She is also an active community volunteer, giving her time as a judge for Australia's annual Grief Writers Competition, which sees up to 1,000 entries every year. In Queensland, she is a regular supporter of the Homicide Victims Support Group and the Care for Life World Suicide Prevention Day. Doris was born and raised in Geelong, educated at Monash University, and has lived on the Gold Coast since 1993, but I'm told she remains a very keen cat supporter. So please everyone, warmly welcome Doris.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, first of all, for the invitation to come here. I think Annie contacted me first, and then I've done lots of toing and froing with Norelle. I was thrilled for 2 reasons to be asked to come today, because as my bio says, I'm born and raised in Geelong, and I thought, yippee, I get to come to Victoria. But it was also the first face-to-face thing I think I'd been asked to do for almost 2 years. And I couldn't come fast enough. And we drove down from the Gold Coast. People think we're nuts. But we've spent about 3 days driving down here, and I'm thrilled to be here in Beechworth. So thank you so much. I also want to say this from listening to the Mayor before, who said that you didn't have to be mad to be put into the asylum. And he listed, PTSD and some of the other reasons why people might have been assigned to the asylum. And I thought to myself, I bet there were people who had grief, and that's all they had, but they were assigned there as well. So it's really timely on this piece of land, I think, that we talk all about grief. And I said to Annie when we spoke, I really wanted to take sort of a contemporary look at what do people think about grief today in 2022. So that's going to be my focus. And then I can't help myself, but I'll then put it into the cemetery crematoria type of scenario. Before I retired from InvoCare last year, I spent about 2 years working with the SemCrem division there. And this is something I learned, that in my 27-year career there, I'd spent nearly 99% of my energy working in the funeral division, training the funeral directors about grief and loss and empathy and customer service and all of that. And the cemetery people were sort of over there because all they did was dig holes and mow lawns and that kind of stuff. And my last 2 years, not that I think I needed teaching, but I probably needed to be focused there, I found that people just absolutely grabbed everything they could get around grief, information, education, because they wanted to talk to grieving people. And they also wanted to know they were saying and doing the right things. So I'm going to sort of finish up in that space. I've got about an hour or so to speak to you, and then we've got time for questions as well. And I'm going to say this now because I'm too scared I'll forget. At the end, I was going to bring some handouts for you, some take-home stuff, but instead I've decided to give you one of my books. It's called Now That the Funeral is Over, and that's when people obviously come and see many of you. And I love the way my publishers put this. I didn't put this on the title. They put The Common Sense Guide for Grieving People. So today I hope I'm going to talk some common sense to you, but there's a copy for each of you and they'll be out on the registration table for you to take home. Okay, we're going to start with a little bit of true or false about grief. Then I'm going to talk about this whole idea of continuing bonds, maintaining a connection with the person who's died, which is very much the opposite to being told you have to move on, you have to put it behind you, you have to get over it. All of that language, is very old-fashioned. I also want to talk about, I think, what's a fairly contemporary term these days in giving people support called holding space. And I talk a lot about how do you show up? How do you show up when there's a grieving person in front of you? Probably in the olden days, I might have just said, let's call that how empathetic are you? But I want to talk a bit about empathy because something I've learned over the years that I've worked in this field is a lot of people think they're being empathetic when they're actually not empathetic. When you say to me, I know how you feel, I know you've got no empathy at all. And yet we often think that's our way of conveying that I understand what you're telling me. And this is something I absolutely know from talking to grieving people. They judge your empathy by what comes out of your mouth. And it better be good. It better connect with them. They don't know how much compassion you've got in your heart. They don't know that you're thinking, oh my God, that's the worst story I've ever heard. That's so sad what happened to this family. But if stuff comes out of your mouth, it's not empathetic, they will think you have no compassion. So we need to make sure, that we speak with accurate empathy. So I want to get straight into true or false. And I thought I would start here. This is really basic, but I'm surprised at the number of people who over the years have said to me, I didn't know that was sort of a loss. No wonder I've been struggling, or no wonder I've been so upset. Because when we hear the word loss, what do we often think we're talking about? Someone has a loss. What do we think? Death. I think we think loss and death and grief, they go together. And it's actually, loss that creates grief of any sort. And so for me, you don't only grieve when someone dies. And I just got, who's got grief? And I've put up some examples, but surely I could have filled 3, 4, 5 slides. In our society today, divorce and separation are the number one cause of loss and grief in family life. It's actually not death. So that's interesting, isn't it? I often say kids learn about loss and grief when mum and dad get divorced, not when someone dies in their family. Any kind of poor health, all the stuff to do with work, unemployment, redundancy, workplace restructure, all the changes. People often say that people are loath to embrace change. Change actually occupies some loss and grief space in our lives as well. Any kind of broken hopes and dreams. I wanted to put in some things that you couldn't see, but that might be affecting me. And you might think, Doris isn't her usual self at the moment. She's become really quiet, or she just doesn't, socialise like she used to, or she's in a really bad mood, or whatever, because something has happened around my hopes, dreams, plans, aspirations that haven't eventuated, and I might be grieving over that. Moving away from family, friends. I always say when I left Geelong to go to the Gold Coast, I cried for a year. And people go, you what? You cried for a year? And I said, yes, I did. I didn't know I was moving to Disneyland. It was the closest thing to what I imagined. I've never been to Disneyland, but the Gold Coast was so nothing like Geelong, I didn't fit in. So much so, this is a true story and I now digress, I ended up meeting, this woman she became a Member of Parliament sort of a few years ago in Queensland. She said to me one day, Doris, you've got to lose the Melbourne look. And I said, what's that? And she goes, and look at me today, it's that navy blue you always wear. And I met her at these sort of women's networking functions that I started to go to make some friends because I was grieving because I'd moved away and I didn't know anybody. And she said, you look too Melbourne. That was a slap on the wrist. And what she meant was you have to buy more white and gold and wear that. Needless to say, I didn't, and I still haven't. Natural disasters, and do I have to talk about that with bushfires and obviously flood and what we've had in Queensland of late. I might tell you this too. When I go home next week, I've been invited by the Murwillumbah Chamber of Commerce to speak at their monthly meeting, and Murwillumbah was one of the little Northern Rivers towns that was affected by the floods. But guess what they've said to me? They said, can you not say the words loss and grief? Because we're like Chamber of Commerce people and we don't want it to seem too griefy. And they've invited the grief lady. And they said, can you write a paragraph to put in our newsletter, to invite people? And so I had to write a paragraph about what I'm talking about without saying loss and grief. Boy, was that a challenge. And this is what I've decided to do. I'm going to talk about loss and grief without saying loss and grief until my last 5 minutes. And then I'm going to tell them that everything I've talked about today is about loss and grief. Because this is something I know. If you don't give it the right language, we feel like we have no right to be grieving. We feel like, we're overreacting, we're being a drama queen, or we should be over it. But if we're told this is okay, this is actually loss that you've been through, and because you're feeling that your world's been turned upside down, we call that grief. Then that gives people permission to not be their usual selves. So I've just about given you my final, 3 minutes of what I'm going to say. Lost self-esteem, confidence, any of those sorts of things, again, which I can't see, people can't see, but I could be going through it. Getting old, unwelcome changes in your life. I could do a whole hour on that one. And I put this at the bottom of the list, not because it's not important, but because I just wanted you to see that in everyday life, there's lots of other stuff other than death that causes people to grieve. And I actually added a hero when Shane Warne died, and I thought, how many people are grieving? And we act like we all knew him, and it's very real grief. We find with children, teenagers in particular, they grieve over pop stars who die, over sports heroes, all sorts of people like that, and they really think they knew them because they followed them on Facebook or social media or something like that. And parents often think they're overreacting or they're being silly, but in actual fact, they feel a connection. And we grieve when a connection that we perceive was real and significant has been broken, has been taken away from us. That's why we grieve. I couldn't talk about who's got grief without talking about COVID-19. I think in the last 2 years, we've all done some grieving over the way our lives have changed, and to varying degrees. I've been saying this when I speak. I've never seen the word grief in the media so much as I have in the last 2 years, where they actually are using it in terms of COVID. Grief never made the media at all, and even the words loss. But it's also interesting, one of the other sort of language elements that go with COVID is mental health issues. And mental health is just the trendiest space to work in at the moment. But I want to say this, if I've got grief, I haven't got a mental health issue. It becomes a mental health issue if I don't learn how to manage it. But because I cry because something's gone wrong, I haven't got a mental health issue. Because I'm not happy about it, because I sort of feel like the rug's been pulled out from underneath me, I haven't got a mental health issue. I've got grief, and they're not the same. It can become a mental health issue, but it doesn't mean I've got one because I'm grieving about something. I've added the wedding and funeral restrictions because I think in our world, I'm sure you all experience that, you know, if you work in cemeteries and crematorias where there are chapels and we had restrictions with numbers and so forth. My mum in Geelong, she died during COVID, and she died about nearly 2 years ago, now about 18 months. And she died when, you know, the Ring of Steel was happening in Melbourne. And, you know, I got the phone call from, I've got a sister and brother in Melbourne, that things weren't looking good for Mum, and, you know, I was best to come down to Geelong. She was in a nursing home at the time. And so I, you know, booked a flight, came down, and I was fortunate to spend 2 weeks with Mum before she died. But the thing that we had to get our heads around was she was only allowed 20 people at her funeral. And I've worked in the funeral industry all my life, and my mum, who was 92, got 20 people. And I felt that was so unfair. And if I'm being really honest, I think I was like more hurt by that than almost losing Mum. It was like, you know, we knew she was old, we knew she was sick, we knew she was not going to get better. But it was not right that only 20 people could be at her funeral. And the saddest part for me, and I could just about tear up now telling you this, is that nobody from Queensland came apart from me. And she's got grandchildren there, she's got great-grandchildren there. My school friends who lived in my mum's house, my mum was German, and I tell you what, could she put together some great German food. And all my girlfriends would say, oh, is she making apple strudel, you know, when they'd come over? And they're always, I'd want to eat, you know, a lamington or a meat pie at their place, but oh no, they'd want to eat Mum's wog food, as we called it. Well, none of my friends in Geelong could come to her funeral, and it was just so sad for me. And this is what we ended up doing. We said to all the family, and I've got, you know, a nephew in America, and we had, you know, people in other parts of the country, send a photo by email, we'll blow it up and print it and frame it, and we'll have a chair for each of you in the chapel. And my mum loved orchids. My dad grew the most amazing orchids ever. And so orchids were one of the flowers that we had at her funeral. So everyone got a stem of orchids on their chair. And we had probably about 20 of these chairs with photos from those who couldn't come. That's all my Queensland family there. And at the end of the service, we gathered up the orchids and we took them to the cemetery where Mum was buried. And the orchids actually were placed on her coffin. They went down in her grave with her. And we tried to represent the people who couldn't be there, who were family, with the chair. And the funeral director said to me when, you know, we sort of came early and we put all our photos and things out in the chairs, and they said, oh, wow, we've never seen the photo chair thing before. And I actually had written a training program about this for funeral directors. I was still working at InvoCare at the time with how to deal with COVID, and I never in my wildest dreams thought that I'd implement the empty chair thing at my own mum's funeral. But that's how we did it. And as nice as it is, it was still quite heartbreaking to have just 20 of us, supposedly 1.5 metres apart, even though we squashed our chairs up, you know, when we could. So lots of people dealing with loss and grief because of COVID. And I picked this up actually on the internet. The COVID pandemic will be outlasted by the grief pandemic. And I think we don't yet even know what some of the long-term effects of people being denied access to their loved ones will be. The people who couldn't be at bedsides, the people who couldn't go to a funeral at all, the people who couldn't have a viewing and so forth, the people who couldn't travel from interstate because of border restrictions and so forth. I think we don't even know yet how much grief maybe they carrying in here, because this is something I know. When you have a funeral, that is the place where you can let some grief out. And I think some people kind of have kept it in because there was nowhere to put it. There was no formal place to put your grief because there was no funeral to be had. So my next true or false, there are stages of grief you have to go through. I thought everybody knew in 2022 that there are no more stages of grief. that happened in the 1960s, 70s. It was sort of, we all talked about it and whatever. But I read some, article the other day about something to do with loss and grief, and it says, it is like the 5 stages of grief. And I wanted to go, wrong. It's so out of context these days, out of fashion. We really don't talk about stages of grief. And this is something some people don't know. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the famous author of the book On Death and Dying, where she wrote about the 5 stages of grief, do you know she wasn't actually talking about grieving people who had had a death? Some people don't know that. You know, she was talking about people who were terminally ill in St Christopher's Hospice in London, where she was working, and she observed the 5 stages they went through of dying. She wasn't talking about their relatives who were grieving because they were going to die. And over the years, it's sort of become the grief story. So I just felt I had to put it in for you. So we just, put it on the table and say, we don't kind of talk about stages of grief. We've moved beyond that to a far more individual story. Grief is whatever it feels like to you. And if it's happening to you and it's normal for you, that's normal grief. That's just so freeing, I think. I read somewhere one time, your grief is what you say it is. You are the expert in your own grief. Hallelujah, I thought. You are the expert in your own grief. And so this sort of stuff, whilst it was helpful at the time, because at least it gave us some information, people don't see it as that restrictive anymore. I reckon it's a bit more like this. Grief is just like a crazy mixed up time for most people. We go round and round in circles, it turns us upside down, we go forwards, we go backwards. Some days we think we're never going to get through this. And I absolutely know this too. There's the old you, there's you who you were before the event happened, and grief changes you. Grief and change are synonymous. Grief changes you, and you come out being a new person. You could be a changed person. You could have learned many lessons. It's very trendy in grief these days to talk about what grief teaches people and the sort of new horizons that grieving people get, and how that's a positive side of grief. It's also said that unless we face a crisis, we're not actually forced to look at our lives and work out, how to kind of be resilient, to focus on how will I survive this. When life is going along swimmingly, we're not forced to change anything. But as soon as there's a crisis, we have to suddenly ask ourselves, how am I going to survive this? And we have to call up everything we've got inside to say, I'm going to get through this. And that's what you do when you're grieving. I also know this, and I say this to grieving people, I know 4 things are going to happen, 4 types of reactions. You're going to think about your grief. You're going to lie in bed. You're going to be driving in the car. You're going to be on your own, or you'll be at work, daydreaming, looking out the window, and you'll be thinking about what's happening to you. You'll certainly feel stuff as well, whether you want to or not, whether you want to own it or not. We all have feelings. Grief definitely affects your wellness and your health, and some people don't know that. People get sick when they're grieving. They get sick. And last of all, we do things, and often we do things out of character, and people will say, I've never been like this before. I've never done that before. I've never said that before. I've never thought that before. That's because you didn't have this grief before. That's what grief does to you. So I like to say to people, grief is more than stuff about feelings. It's more than stuff about being sad. It's way bigger than that. And again, if I had loads of time and loads of space, I could say that there's, plenty of thoughts, plenty of feelings, plenty of behaviours, and plenty of things that grief does to your health. When I talk to people who work with adolescents, I say the most important little box for you is the behaviours. Adolescents do not come home from school and say to their mum and dad, I am bereft today. I am grieving over the loss of my boyfriend who dumped me at lunchtime. What they do is they'll show you what it feels like. And they'll come in and they'll slam the door and they'll go to their room and they'll turn the music on and you'll say, dinner's ready in 30 minutes, and they'll go, oh yeah. You know, and that's how they behave. And Mum says, so what's the matter with you? Oh, as if you'd care. You know, that's what they do. And I once, years ago, did a thing on grief for Queensland Police. And I had this big slide on behaviours of grieving adolescents. And one of the constables, when I'd done the slide, puts his hand out and goes, Miss, and I love it when people call me Miss, Miss, that's every kid I've ever arrested. And I thought, yeah, because that's what kids do. They do antisocial stuff as much as anything. So that's an interesting part about grief. Again, that, you know, we don't tell parents this. And this is what happens because when we don't tell them, they then get told off for grieving. They're then told to smarten up because they're grieving. What my bio didn't say was that I was a high school teacher in Geelong before I joined the funeral industry. I wish I knew now, or then what I know now, because I reckon every kid that I gave bin duty to at lunchtime was probably a grieving kid. You know, they were in class, they were playing up, they didn't do their homework, they back-chatted, they picked on other kids, they bullied kids in the playground, and there were reasons why they were doing that. But you know, we just didn't know enough at the time. We just called it antisocial or bad behaviour. Here's I wanted to share this with you, a different view of grief altogether. It's something that I created and I based it on a book that I've got called After Suicide. And it's a book written by Dr. Sheila Clark. She's from Adelaide. And she does work with families after there's been a suicide death. And she created, it doesn't look like that, but I kind of turned it into that. She created like a piece of paper and it had like little triangles on it that were meant to be like little mountains. And she said every triangle represents like a little mountain that you have to climb up and over when you're grieving. And what she would do with it is she'd say to people, take this pen, colouring pen, and colour in how much of that mountain you think you've already done. How much of that mountain you haven't even got to yet. How much of that mountain, when it's fully coloured in, you've climbed it. You're at the top of that mountain. It's not going to bother you anymore. And she wanted people to visually see how they were progressing in their grief. And this is something that would happen. You could imagine if you did it with 5 people in a family, you'd have 5 different pictures, people everywhere, all in different spaces, of which part of these mountains they had climbed already. And the other thing I thought about when I read about this was it wouldn't just be now, like grief changes over time. So it's an activity worth doing over time to see how your grief changes. So this is something I did, and I only did this, I reckon I've had this book forever, about 3 years ago. I thought, I'm going to do a little one of these for myself and just see what my grief looked like if I had to tell someone about it. And some of you who know me might know that many years ago I had a daughter who died of cot death, 1980 actually, so a long, long time ago. But for those of you who wonder if you ever forget, I have never forgotten June the 17th, 1980, walking into her bedroom after the 7 o'clock news and finding her dead in her cot. I have never forgotten that, and I will never forget that. And the people that say to me, oh, aren't you over that? I don't have to be over it. And I don't aim to be over it, by the way. I aim to know how to live with it, how to learn to live with it. Well, I decided I was going to look at when Claire died and look at my picture and see what happened, because this was my theory that I really believe in. Nobody really knows what your grief looks like to you. And if they think you're going through 5 stages, well, heaven help them, because it's way worse than that. Way worse than that. If only there were just 5 things that I needed to do. So here's my picture over time of how I think life was for me when Claire died. So my first one is this. This is what I call my early days. So I've coloured in, and the yellow is how much of this was going on in my life. So a lot of shock, A lot of numbness, a lot of disbelief, a lot of just living on autopilot. I couldn't get through it. Do you know, I could not understand how a healthy child could be put to bed and not wake up. It just did not compute in here at all. And it didn't matter how much theory you gave me or a brochure I got on cot death or what my GP said to me, it did not compute in here that the youngest person in our family was the first one to die. Like my mum, dad, everyone outlived her, and they couldn't compute that either. Mum and dad kept saying, it should have been us. You know, it's our time. It should have been us. But it wasn't. You know, I learned this. I don't think I'm a big crier because I didn't do a lot of crying. But I also know this. I'm one of these naughty people that says to herself, don't cry. People expect you to be strong. I was also brought up in a household where we were not criers. Mum used to say, I'll give you something to cry about. And, you know, and this is what I learned though. I learned that as a kid, and so that's what I did as an adult. I'll give you something to cry about. Now, here's one of the worst things I've ever said in my life, I think, to anybody. On the morning of Claire's funeral, as Pete, my husband, and I were getting ready for the funeral, I said to him, and I could just cut my tongue out now when I think about it, I said, Pete, we are not going to cry at the funeral today. We have to be strong for everybody. And I said, if we start crying, everybody else is going to cry. So we have to do our darndest to get through this today. That's what I said to him. So I don't remember crying at her funeral. I do not remember it. But what do you think other people thought? They would have thought, oh, they're so strong. I'm so proud of them. If it were me, I would have fallen apart, but not Doris. She's so strong. But guess what you then do for yourself? You set yourself up for failure. Because then when you do start to cry, people go, well, what's wrong with you? You were so strong when it happened. My mum said to me, Claire died in June, and I reckon it was the following Mother's Day, like the next year, and we'd been to the cemetery and we'd taken some flowers, and then it was everyone to Mum's house for Mother's Day lunch, and I'd obviously been bawling my eyes out and I probably looked like crap, and I got to Mum's place and I was pretty quiet, and I'm usually, you know, fairly bubbly, and Mum said, oh, not that long face again. Because you see, I didn't cry at her funeral. And a year later, I was still trying to work out how I was going to deal with this. Look at my picture. I hadn't even begun. Here's my early days, first few weeks, and perhaps the first few months. Let me go back to this. I say a lot about crying. The why question. The why was the part of I couldn't comprehend. Why this? Why of God? She died the week after she'd been baptised, and I'm thinking last week we're at church, kind of welcoming her into the church community, and this week we're there for a funeral. It just made no sense at all. Full of guilt. Why would you be full of guilt? Why would you be full of guilt? I didn't do it. I'll tell you why. Your number one job as a parent is to protect your children. Your number one job as a parent is to outlive your children. Your number one job as a parent is to save them from all the bad things that happen out there in the world. And I felt like we'd failed. We'd failed badly at parenting 101. And a lot of that goes, and I was a little bit, but not a lot angry, that was still to come. Why do you think there's shame? Why do you think there's shame? And I wanted to be really honest and put these words there because that's how we felt. I'll tell you why there's shame. Because we were the sort of parents where your child died in your care. Like, what's wrong with you? And again, this is what I want you to know about grief. Grief isn't what reality should be. Grief is what it is for you. Grief is how you perceive the world to be. So if my perception was, people will think, what's wrong with them? Their child died. Like, is it something they did, or is it something... As a mother, I was a breastfeeding mother, I thought for days it was something in my milk that killed her. Must have been, because we didn't know, why cot death killed her. So there's a lot of this stuff that no one knows that you bear inside you when you're grieving. Going through the motions of living, I did that forever. On the outside, I think people probably thought she's pretty good. On the inside, I was a mess. So let's move on. 6 months, have a look at my picture. 6 months, still got some of they can't comprehend. Some, look at the crying, about equal. Lots of the why, lots of the guilt, the blame, the anger, still thinking, God, this is weird. And some of these other things, I know that I was pretty flat, I was pretty down. I wanted to talk about isolation. This is how isolation happens. I went back to work as a teacher some months after Claire died. There were 110 teachers on our staff. Those of you here from Geelong, I saw quite a few Geelong people, I taught at Oberon High School in Belmont. About 110 teachers, about 1,000 kids, a staff room with 2 doors like this. If I walked in that door, everyone filed out the other door. It was like, oh, Struth, here she comes. I hope she doesn't sit at our table, because then they'd have to look at me and say something. So it was really interesting. But I felt isolated in groups of families where people had all their kids, but I was missing one. I didn't go to mother's group anymore because I wasn't really kind of a mother now of a baby. And so I just felt like I just didn't fit in. And quest for positives, I did try to think of positive. I remember saying to myself, at least she wasn't sick and that we had to have her in hospital and watch her suffer. I did say to myself, it would have been painless, I think, and that would have been better than some terrible accident. I did think, and I think I thought this about there, I'm glad we had her, because think of the people who can't have any children at all. At least I know what it's like to be a mother. I know that was really, really important to me. New relationship with the deceased, I'll tell you where that was. That was at the cemetery. I used to take my lunch from school, lunchtime, drive over to the cemetery, sit on Claire's grave, eat my sandwiches, cry into them, dry my eyes, put some lipstick on and go back and teach the next lesson after lunch. My relationship was with a little suitcase of clothes that I kept of her stuff. And when the house was quiet and nobody was home, I'd take her stuff out and I would, true story, I would take her little jumpsuits and I'd hold them up to my face and I'd smell them. I could try and smell her in them. And we had, a tiniest little photo album of photos. That was what we had left, and that was the relationship I had. And still lots of, I couldn't see any purpose in this. I couldn't find meaning in life 6 months down the track. But I wanted to show you this. People would have thought we're coping beautifully. She's back at work. Everything looks fine. She's good to go. But my picture was quite different. 1 year, have a look. She's still not good to go. And after a year, and the reason why I wanted you to see 6 months and a year is often that's when you're meeting people in the cemeteries. Often that's when people are getting around to getting headstones done or coming for, Christmas and to lay flowers and all those sort of Dad's birthday and that sort of stuff. So you're meeting them and they're not fixed yet, they're not mended yet, they're still in the thick of their grief. And then I've got more than 5 years. So have a look, there's still grief. More than 5 years, there's still grief. But fortunately, some of the stuff, has diminished quite a bit. But all of the things that I call the new life, the managing, the living without her, not done yet. Still working on that. Still wondering why could happen to us, still not having an answer and so forth. So I give you this version of grief because I think it's very different to the 5 stages of grief. And again, if I said to all of you now, I'll give you one of these little pieces of paper with no colour and you do your own colouring in, we'd all do a different lot of colouring in over the losses that we've had in our life. And that's the picture we want to see if we really want to understand grieving people. What does your picture look like? and it'll always look different to mine. And that's why, that I know how you feel is totally irrelevant, and it's actually wrong. You don't know how I felt because you didn't see my picture. And this is something else I learned, and I'll move on to this in a moment. I learned that not many people asked what was in my picture because they were too scared. They were just too scared to ask. Next to our files, Be Strong, Don't Cry. I think we all hopefully know about that, but I thought I still had to put that in because there's still people who think being strong, is the way to cope. I love this quote. I love this. People cry not because they're weak, it's because they've been strong for too long. And I think that's so true, that, they just tough it out and tough it out and tough it out rather than have an opportunity to, work on their grief or tell someone about it. But it reminded me of this. I picked this up in the newspaper. It was about 3 years ago, actually. It was certainly pre-COVID, about Prince Harry. I've kind of highlighted bits in yellow. Spending nearly 20 years not thinking about his mother who died. And he became the party boy. Remember that? He was doing all these weird behaviours. Remember that? Behaviour stuff is what he did. Not because he wanted to party, because he wanted to forget. He wanted to not think about his mum. And he said, why would it help thinking about mum? It's only going to make you sad. It's not going to bring her back. And then all of a sudden, this grief I'd never processed started to come to the forefront, and I was very close to a complete breakdown. So that's what happens when we don't do our grieving. And I don't think I put it true or false, time will heal. There's never a falser thing being said than time will heal. Time does nothing if you don't work on your grief. Time just marches on. And if you've swept it under the carpet, it sits under the carpet for 20 years until you decide to visit it and say, I'm going to do something. And that's how it becomes a mental illness. When people find that they are overwrought, overcome, and they can't deal with all those circles and so forth. When I read that, I so wanted to do circles with Harry. I thought Harry would have been a great contender for those circles. I bet some of them he would have still been, after 20 years, full up with stuff that he'd never processed, never told anybody about, had to pretend. And one of his circles should have been partying, or being the larrikin, because that's often what he did on the outside. Yeah. So these days we have this idea called, continuing bonds as such, as I said before, rather than saying, well, when are you going to get over it? And I love this idea. And this is sort of what it means. And I wish Harry knew this, that when someone dies, you don't have this linear process of, stages, and you get to the end and you all get to acceptance and everything's fine. But what we do find is that slowly you've got to learn to adjust. And that's really what, for me, the grieving process is. It's learning to adjust. Every day I've got to learn something new. I've got to learn, if I go back to when my daughter died, I had to learn to sit with families that had all their children when I didn't have one of mine and try and sit through a barbecue without crying. I had to learn to do that until I could do it and not feel angry or resentful or bitter or whatever. They're the sorts of things you have to do. But I love this bit about you redefine the relationship. So in other words, it's saying you don't have to put it behind you. You don't have to act like they never existed. You don't have to not talk about them. You redefine the relationship with the person. And it's okay to have a continued bond. Not because you're a nutter and you haven't let them go. I love that. You've got to let them go. Go where? Where do you let them go to? Or when they say you have to move on, where do you move to? Like, where is that space that I'm supposed to go to? And so we have this idea now of a continued bond that will endure in different ways to varying degrees throughout your life. So it may start like this and it might end like that. I wanted to sort of stop and talk a little bit about that. I was talking at a conference, it's a little while ago, and someone in the audience came up to me afterwards. He was actually a funeral director, and he said, "Can I talk to you about that continuing bond stuff?" And I said, "What do you want to say?" And he said, No one knows this, but when my dad died about 3 years ago, I wrote him a Father's Day card every year for 3 years because I just had to do it. But I didn't do it this year. I just didn't need to do it. And that's what that is, to varying degrees. At first you had to keep writing them, but now I'm good. I don't have to write. I know in here that Dad knows how I feel, and I'm kind of good with that. But at the beginning, I had to write to my dad. That's a continuing bond, and it's a healthy way of dealing with your grief. But could you imagine if this bloke had have told someone, one of his mates, I just wrote my dad a Father's Day card and he died 3 years ago. People would say, oh, he's mad, he's nuts. He's got a mental health crisis. No, he hasn't. He's connected to his dad and he's not just ready yet to stop talking to his dad. When my dad died 10 years ago, my mum's GP said to her when she would go and visit him, and my dad's name was Michael, do you still talk to Michael every day? Mum was telling me this, and she said, of course I do. I talk to him every day, all day. And my GP, or Mum's GP, says, well, I'm glad to hear that. That man was a genius. Mum didn't need grief counselling, and she didn't have a mental health problem because her GP said, do you still talk to Michael every day? And to varying degrees, she did that until she died. She said to me one day, I was on the phone to her from Queensland, and it was after sort of dinner, and I said, Mum, what are you doing? And she said, oh, I just lit Dad's candles. And I didn't know about this, and I said, oh, tell me, what have you done? She said, oh, you know the photo we had on his coffin? And I said, yes. I've got that in the lounge room. I knew it was in the lounge room, sort of on a mantelpiece thing. And she said to me, every night I light some candles for Dad, and when I've finished watching TV and I'm off to bed, I blow out the candles, and this is the bit. She said, and I kiss him goodnight, just like I always did. That is a continuing bond. My mother has never read a book on grief, but she kind of knew what she needed to do because she is the expert in her own grief. I thought that was just the most amazing thing because Mum had been kissing Dad goodnight. They were married for 62 years. She'd been doing it for 62 years. Why would you stop now? So I love those sorts of things that people do to a varying degree. In the years sort of after, I'd say maybe, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, no, about 7, 8 years, because then she's in a nursing home, she didn't light those candles as often as she used to. And if I'd come down, I'd say, Mum, can I light the candles? And she'd go, oh, yes, I forgot. She just sort of didn't need to do it. But in the early days, she needed to do it. So, here's my dad's grave. This is at the Highton Cemetery, Geelong, folks. Can you see the little hip flask on the top of the headstone? This is my brother's continuing bond with my dad. My dad and my brother, they were so close. He was the third born child. He was the first son. Do I need to say any more? He was born 5 years after me. When I was born, second daughter, my father said to my mum, this is a true story, and Mum rang him, because in those days where fathers weren't at the birth, and Mum rang him and said, you have another daughter, and he goes, oh. And Mum said, when are you coming to see me? And he goes, I'll wait till you get home. I've already got a daughter, I know what they look like. I reminded him of that many, many times. So anyway, the prize boy, my brother, is born 5 years after me. They were absolutely just so close. At Dad's funeral, my dad's Ukrainian, and at Dad's funeral, we had vodka. Ukrainians have vodka instead of breast milk. I'm absolutely convinced they do. So this is what we did at Dad's funeral, because Dad had a little shot glass, and if you come to Dad's house, he would have loved, he loved people. He'd put a bottle of vodka on the table, half a dozen shot glasses, and he'd say, have a hot one, help yourself. It was always a hot one. So anyway, at his funeral, at the burial bit, we had one last hot one with Dad. So the funeral director's job was to pour everyone a shot glass of vodka, and we all stood round Dad's grave, and my brother sort of set a toast to Dad, and we all just, threw down our shot glass of vodka. But my dad always had the same shot glass for years and years and years. And if we bought him a new set of shot glasses for Father's Day or something, they went in the back of the cupboard somewhere, and he always used his favourite little one. So we put his favourite one on the lid of his coffin, and he got the last little tipple of vodka. And his shot glass, his hot one, went down the grave with him as we threw down our vodkas. So vodka has a very special meaning in our lives. I don't even drink the stuff, but I do on Dad's birthday, and I do on his anniversary. And my brother has his flask in his car. So when he goes to the cemetery, he has a shot of vodka with Dad, and he'll send me a photo like this, and he'll just say, having a shot with Dad today, and I know exactly where he is. He doesn't have to say anymore. So when I was in Geelong, I thought, can't be outdone by my brother, so I've got my bottle of vodka. I've got a shot glass for Dad. I'll just there, and a shot glass for me. And Dad and I are having a vodka too. Now that's become a continuing bond. And because I can't get to the Highton Cemetery all that often, on Dad's anniversary, on his birthday, Christmas, we'll always have a drink for Dad. And we don't need words. We'll just take like a selfie, and I'll send it to my brother. He'll send it to me and go, having a shot for Dad, or I'll just send one, remembering Dad today. That's our continuing bond. The reason why I want to tell you things like this is because people need to know it's okay. I think when you're grieving, you're often so worried about what people will think if you do stuff like this. Will they think I'm not getting over it? Will they think I'm kind of lingering in the grief? Will they think I should have moved on? Because no one thinks, oh, she wants to keep that bond going with her dad, and it's okay. My mum died, as I said, recently. This is the bond with my mum. Mum was German. Every Christmas she made not gingerbread biscuits, we call them Pfefferkuchen. And we have a Pfefferkuchen baking day at my house before Christmas, and I make hundreds for the grandkids, the great-grandkids, for everybody. And my two grandsons, Huey and Lewis, they come and we have a Pfefferkuchen decorating day. This is the continuing bond for me with my mother, but for them with their great-grandmother. And the boys will say to me, when is Pfefferkuchen Day? They call me Mima, which I love. When is Pfefferkuchen Day? Because they want to come and they do it every year. That's a continuing bond. So that's our family and how we do it. But there's lots of ways of doing it. Just talking to the person is a way of doing it. Write to them, journal about them, keep photos. You don't have to put them away. Tell new people. Nothing wrong with telling someone about someone in your family who's died. Pass on advice they would give you, finish a project, take a trip, have keepsakes, have a memorial. This is where continuing bonds have such a big place in cemeteries. If I owned a cemetery, or if I worked in a cemetery, I would think about what do I do on a very big continuing bond day, like a Mother's Day, a Father's Day and Easter, but then remember birthdays, anniversaries, they're all continuing bond days. Or what would I do for the people who just come whenever, just to continue the bond? What do I do? And I'm not certain we often celebrate those days enough. Like you, the owners, the trustees, the people that work there, I'm not sure that we do enough talking about it's okay to be here, it's okay to come. And it isn't just about laying flowers, it's about having vodka if you want to. I did something I used to for Newcastle in New South Wales, Newcastle's Memorial Park it was called. They decided some years ago that they wanted every Christmas, you know how a lot of cemeteries, crematoriums, funeral homes do like a Christmas memorial service, a Mother's Day service, something like that. They wanted to do something on Christmas time, but they didn't want to do a service. And they said to me, could you think of something and could you do it? And I said, why don't we run a little thing about coping with grief on your first Christmas without this person. We'll call it, your first Christmas without someone. And we'll have it here in the cemetery and we'll have it in your chapel, but we're not going to do a service with prayers and hymns, and we're going to just talk about grief and that very first Christmas, what it could be like. Well, anyway, packed audience, packed house, people came. I was shocked. First year, lots of people. Second year, lots who came last year, and they came again. Some people said to me, I brought my neighbour this time because her husband died during the year. But people wanted to know it was all right to be miserable on your first Christmas. And it was all right, though, to think of what sort of continuing bonds could we have. And I would talk about what's a continuing bond for Christmas time that you might think about so that you don't have to pretend you're okay when you're not. And people, I think, really wanted that permission that if they didn't like the sound of jingle bells in the shopping centres and didn't want to send Christmas cards this year, and they just felt that there's going to be an empty seat at the Christmas table they couldn't bear to look at, what could we do to honour that? People need to be told. So I used to go to Newcastle every 2 or 3 weeks before Christmas, and I'd run my little session on coping with Christmas the first time without. I was so surprised at the number of people that came, so surprised. But I remember one family said it, we had like question time at the end. One family, a person puts his hand up, there's a man, he says, well, whether they like it or not here, his dad was buried in this Newcastle cemetery. He said, we're coming on Christmas Day and we're bringing our Barbie and we're going to have a Barbie with Dad on Christmas Day. And the cemetery manager is in the room, so he stands up and puts his hand up and he says, you don't have to bring your own Barbie. We've got a staff one. You tell us where you want it set up. We'll set it up for you and have a happy Christmas on us. I wanted to kiss them both. Continuing bonds. That's what it's about. So I put that out to you and say to you, when was the last time you had a Barbie in your cemetery? I wonder, because that's stuff that brings people, not for, you would know this better than I know it. People still think cemeteries are creepy places. I don't know if any of you know Allambie Gardens on the Gold Coast in Queensland. That's where I had my office on the same grounds. I had an office at Somerville Funerals, part of Allambie Gardens. So I went to a cemetery every day for 27 years to work. I'm good with them, but most people aren't. They aren't. So I just put it out there. How could we make cemeteries a place where people want to visit, but not just to visit the grave, to be there and continue the bond? Incorporate them into family events, those sorts of things. Do something special. Whoa, there. And again, the list could go on, but you're the perfect people who can encourage people to do those sorts of things. I think the continuing bond thing is even designing the words on a headstone, designing the words on a plaque. That's kind of saying, this is my connection. This is the last thing I'm going to say that's going to be put into the public space as such. So here's some stuff about grief. Pretty recent. These are good things to know. Grief is natural, thank goodness. It's not a mental health issue. It's unique. And there are commonalities, though. There absolutely are commonalities with people. Most people adapt if they are not impeded. So someone like Prince Harry was impeded. That's why, he kind of stayed in that same space. This is important to note. Only about 10% of people have what's called prolonged grief disorder, sometimes called PGD. So the rest, 90% usually find a way of dealing with it. But I love this one. We do not grieve well alone. We do, and research bears that out. Isn't it funny that research has got to tell us something like that? But I put that one in as much for you because you become part of the interactions with grieving people. And I think sometimes the interactions can be very mechanical. It's about paperwork and filling out stuff and getting the order in and taking the money and all of that, when you could actually be someone who helps them not be so alone in their grief. That's a space that I think you occupy, whether you like it or not. You do occupy that space. And that's, as you can see, fairly recent thoughts on grief. So I want to kind of now change the flavour a little bit to something else about grief. People will say stupid things to you. People will not know what to say. People will avoid you. People will act like it never happened. And people will probably want you not to say too much to them because they don't know what to say back. That was one of my big learnings when our daughter died. I couldn't believe out of 120 teachers that I work with, most of them never ever stopped to say, "So how are you doing today?" It was just, they just didn't know what to say, And so grieving people have to expect to be hurt, to be disappointed, to think, "I thought more of you." And I often say this, when someone comes to a funeral and we get, let's say you're at a funeral and we fill the chapel, we fill the church, we fill the venue with all these people. 1 week after the funeral, how many of these people that all came to the funeral are going to contact the immediate bereaved family? How many? I've done research on this. How many do you reckon, if there's 100 people at the funeral, how many will ring a week later and say, "Just giving you a call, Marge, to see how you're doing since Frank died"? How many of those 100? Spot on, top of the class, all of you. I say around the handful. Were you thinking that? Sort of around the handful? Let's push it out. 3 months after the funeral. How many of all those people are going to ring Marge and say, "Marge, gosh, can't believe how time is moving on. I thought I'd give you a call today and say, how are you doing on your own these days?" How many? Yeah, less than a handful. How many on the first anniversary ring her up and they look at the calendar and go, "Gosh, it's a year since Frank died. I think I might give Marge a call, see how she's doing. Can't be an easy day." So they ring her up and say, "Don't really know what you're doing this week, but I couldn't help but think that it'll be a year since Frank died on Friday. That I just give you a buzz and see how you're doing." Not a lot. How many ring on the first Christmas without Frank and say, "Gosh, it's Christmas around the corner, Marge, so I'd give you a call and just see what you're doing for Christmas this year without Frank." You don't even have to add the "without Frank." We all know it's without Frank as such. And this is what I mean about compassion. I think a lot of people would think of Marge and think, "Oh, poor Marge hasn't got Frank this Christmas." But we don't do anything about it. We don't pick up the phone. And these days with texting, we don't have to do anything. We can just send a message as such. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's better than nothing. But sometimes we just like a face-to-face. We just like someone to pick up the phone and say, "Just wondering what you're doing." You don't have to ring and say, "Marge, I'm just checking in on your grief." You don't have to say that word. Just say, "How are you doing?" Just checking in with you. See what you're doing on Christmas Day. And you might say, "I know it won't be the same this year." Because it won't be. And then let it go. Then, you know what you do? You zip your lip, because I bet Marge is going to have a few things to say. I bet Marge will say, "It's really nice of you to give me a call. I'm dreading Christmas and we're going to my daughter's," and she's off. She's telling you the story and all you have to do is listen. All you have to do is listen. So I think this is a big part of what grieving people do not expect when they're grieving, that people won't know how to have a conversation with them. But guess what? You people who work in the SEM-CREM environment, this is what the public think. They think to get the job you've got, you went to university and you studied Grief 101. And they think you're the expert in grief. And so when they turn up at the front counter, or if they call your office, you will be really comfortable with anything they say to you because you are good at grief, because you work in what we lay people would think is like the grief industry. They don't know this. You're like everybody else in the world who goes, "Oh, I don't want to upset her. Oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Oh, I don't want to put my foot in it. I won't say anything. It's just Christmas around the corner. She'll probably start to cry." And what we often don't know is this. Research bears it out, and my 40-odd years with grieving people bears it out, that grieving people long to talk about the person who's died. I have a lovely quote amongst all of my quotes from my dad, and this is what he says. When you don't mention my son's name who died, my son dies twice. It's really interesting. And often we're so afraid to even say their name. So that's one of my tips. Use the name, say the name to the person who's grieving. But this is what we know. Don't know if you've seen this, people hanging around a funeral actually, and one of them says, never know what to say at people's funerals. Another one goes, oh, neither do I, I'm terrible. And she says, I just say I'm sorry for your loss and move on. So he goes up to the widow and he says, I'm sorry for your loss, move on. I think this is kind of our society. I really think, we truly don't know what to say. I wrote this book called Stuck for Words, What to Say to Grieving People, because I heard so many of these stories from grieving people. They just said, you've got to write something about what to say. Don't write about what is grief. Write about what do you say to someone who's got the grief, because so many people don't know what to say. And it's probably like one of the most popular books I've got. Interestingly, I rewrote it about just before COVID. And I just thought I'd modernise it, read it all and just sort of bring up the language and a few ideas and add and whatever. And I did the intro last, which I always do. And I thought, what am I going to say? So I looked at what I said in the first version. I thought, okay, I'm not going to say that. And this is one of the things that I said. That since I wrote this book 20-odd years ago, the internet has been invented. And so now, anything about grief is at your fingertips. You can look up anything you like, even the things we weren't allowed to say, like suicide, like this, cot death, like this. You can look it up, you get info. It doesn't, pull any punches. It gives you everything. But this is something I've learned, that grieving people say to me, and this would have been like in 2018, 2019, that people still don't know how to talk to them about their grief, and that people by and large are sympathetic, but they don't know about empathy, which are two different things. They're sympathetic, I'm sorry for your loss, but they don't know how to hold a conversation. That did not change in the 20 years. Information changed, but it didn't change. Doesn't that frighten the pants off you? And this is one of the things that I now want to move on to. A little bit about empathy, and then a little bit about using empathy in our workplaces, because that's our connector with grieving people. It's kind of all we got our empathy. Okay, holding space. I want to talk about what sort of space do you hold with a grieving person. So holding space simply means that at some time in our lives, we've got to provide a space that's safe for you to do your grieving. It's got to be caring, non-judgmental and empathetic. Well, that could be a cemetery, couldn't it? Caring, non-judgmental, empathetic. So here are two interesting questions for you. What kind of space do you create? Like, how do you show up every day at work? And what kind of space does your workplace provide? So I want to now go to a little bit of research I did. I spent some time, as I said, at InvoCare working with our cemeteries before I retired. And so I got some real life information. I'm going to show you some real life information. They said, we want to improve our communication with clients in the cemetery space. And so I said, you've got the right person. So I said, what I want to do is, we want to add more empathy to the workplace in our communications, because you're good at the paperwork, you're good at the policies, you're good at the procedures, you're good at that. But I want to know what you like with the you and me, the empathy stuff. So I said, you're sort of in the trenches, when you're with grieving people, like you're there with them in their grief, and it's not your story and they don't want to hear about your stuff, but you've got to be present for them and their story. And this is what I found from talking to cemetery workers. A lot of them didn't provide any space or time for the telling of the story. Like, we did the paperwork, but we didn't ask you what it was like. Let's say I came in 6 months after my daughter died to do her headstone. Nobody would say, Gosh, Doris, before we get down to all the things you'll need to know for, ordering her headstone, her plaque, whatever, can I just ask how things have been going for you in the last 6 months? Can't have been easy. And so they just let me tell a bit of my story. That doesn't enter the conversation often. Can I tell you, I still remember ordering my daughter's headstone, by the way, bronze plaque, and this is what it was like. I had to go to a real estate agent because they had this contract, I guess. This is 40 years ago in Geelong, Moorabool Street. And so I went there to where they were selling real estate, and I sat at a desk that was reserved for cemetery plaque ordering, and that's where I ordered her plaque. And I don't know who the person was. Might have been a real estate by day, and then they go, this lady's coming in at 10:30, wants to order a plaque. Can you go and take the order when she comes in? I do remember that. And I do remember this, and this is what I say about compassion. She might have felt terrible for me. I didn't get that view at all. She was filling in papers. This is one of my least favourite experiences in the same environment when I went to pay the funeral account at the funeral directors. So my husband and I get in the car one morning and the accounts come, whatever, and we decided we're going to pay the account, and that was in the days where I think you took a cheque, so I had a cheque, and went into the funeral home, and a lady came out from somewhere, like they do. You know how they just appear in funeral homes? Just appeared. And I said, I've come in to pay, and I don't know if I said this account or the account for my daughter's funeral. I don't know, but you could see who it was for. And so she said, take a seat and I'll be with you in a minute. I'll just get your file. So she would have got that, and she would have seen, Claire, aged 2.5 months, she would have seen that. So she comes over and she says, so how will you be paying for that? And I said, I've got a bank cheque. So I gave the cheque and she said, just write your receipt, I'll be back in a tick. She comes back, writes me a receipt, comes back, and she says, there you go, dear, I've put it in the envelope for you, you're right to go. And I thought, good. So I got in the car and I said to Pete, and I was 26 years old, I'd never read a thing on grief, I knew nothing about empathy. I don't even reckon I'd heard the word empathy. I knew nothing about what lay ahead for us. And I said to Pete, I feel like I've just bought a fridge. And he looked at me and he said, what happened? Well, I said, nothing. I said, I just thought the lady might have asked us something about Claire or us. And I said, she just gave me a receipt and said, I'm right to go. I remember this 40 years later. I still remember it because I thought she went to the University of Sems and Creams and did Empathy 101 and knew about grieving people and would just have said, and this is my favourite way of saying it, I call it a soft question, is it okay? Is it okay if I ask how you're going? It's a soft question because it asks permission to ask the next question. Is it okay if I ask how your family's coping? Is it okay if I ask how you're doing? To lose a little bubby must have been devastating. Anything that said I'm a human being that works in this establishment. I'm not just a writer out of receipts. And I know this is challenging because it's not something that we've often said is part of a job description. But you know what? Customers are more savvy these days. They expect some humanity and they expect some compassion, I think. And if they get it, they mightily like you. So, one thing I say is we need to check in. And how are you is not a checking in. Why do you think I call it not a checking in? I've got my not so happy face. If I say to you after you've had a death or a divorce or you lost your job, if I say, hi John, how are you? Okay, we all say okay, mine is just fine. I'm fine whether I'm crap or not. I just tell everyone I'm fine. So people get a cliche and they answer with a cliche. So I say you need to be more specific. How are things going since your husband died? How are the children doing since whatever? Make it clear what you're asking because grieving people will probably tell you quite happily. And if you're thinking, but what if they say, mind your own flippin' business and just write out the receipt. Well, guess what? They will say it. You will get them. I reckon I've had one person in 40 years who said to me, can we just move on? Well, that doesn't stop me asking the other thousands of grieving people I've met how they're doing. Just a quick question. I've rarely found someone who is not willing to say something. And a lot of people begin by saying, it's nice of you to ask. I spoke to someone at a conference a few years ago, and it was to do with children's deaths. And I said to her, can I ask, is it okay if I ask, a soft question, what brings you to this conference? And she said, I had a son who died. And I said, oh, was it very long ago? Stay in the conversation. And she said, it's coming up for 8 years. And I said, oh, that's not really long, is it? Well, she just stopped. She said, you're one of the few people who would think that's not very long. She said, to me it was like yesterday, but most people think I've forgotten about it and I've moved on. So, you don't know what's in those circles of the grieving people unless you ask and you engage. So I think we need a better check-in question. And if I say I'm not okay, this is my bugbear with Are You OK Day. That we don't teach people what to say if they say, no, I'm not okay. We go, oh, it can't be that bad. Oh, yes, you will be. You're fine. You're strong. And we sort of have the wrong retort. So if I say I'm not okay, don't say you'll be all right. Don't talk like that. Or what about you're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you? So not only am I not okay, I'm also stupid as such. We need to affirm with people that not being okay is okay. It's okay to not be okay. It's a really important message for grieving people. We need more empathy, and we need those cliches that often jump into our heads when we're talking to grieving people. We need to replace them with empathetic statements. So rather than there are others worse off, I bet with the floods now, that'll be going all over the place. Because the people who didn't lose a house, but think, oh, there are others worse off than you. You didn't lose your whole house, you just lost the ground floor. People lost their business as well as their house. Do you know it makes no difference to my grief to know that there are other people worse off than me? My grief is still my grief and it still hurts me. This will make you stronger. I know this stuff will make me stronger, but you know what? I like being weak. I really liked being not strong. And I know how you feel. I often say to people, if you want to convey that, and I think in the space that many of you occupy, you've seen a lot of grief in your lifetime. You do understand what grief does to people. You do understand how grieving people present at a front counter. So use that word. Say, I see what you mean. I can see where you're coming from. I understand why you would say that, which is a whole lot different to I know how you feel. And so now, coming to what opportunities have we got in our cemeteries to put some of this information about grief and empathy into our communication. So the widow comes to the front desk and she says, come to collect my husband's ashes. It's taken me weeks to get the courage to drive through your front gate. Do people say something like that sometimes? Or, I don't know if you send out letters, but, you might send out a letter and you've got to send out the second letter next month and the next letter the third month and no one turns up. Well, it's not because she likes having her husband's ashes there. She might not be brave enough. She might not know what to do. She might be on her own or whatever. Okay, so have a think. This is an opportunity for engaging with grief and empathy. Not just saying, well, I can help you with that. You'll need to fill out this form first. Come and we'll sit down and we can do it together. Form filling in is coming. Acknowledgement of what she said is where we begin. This is an absolute truth. This will show the compassion in your heart. They will now see they're dealing with someone who's got some empathy. Have you made an appointment? It would have said that in the letter we sent you. Now I'm going to tell some tales. This was the most common response I got from the cemetery people I interviewed about what do you think, and they were honest, what's the most obvious thing that is said when someone walks in, what do you say is the first thing? And they go, we always ask if they've made an appointment because we prefer appointments rather than walk-ins. It's not my problem, I'm the widow, that's your problem. So have you made an appointment? So this is what it gets from me. It gets the not so happy face from the customer. And so what I'm thinking is, if we're putting into practice what I've been talking about, we might say, it is really hard to do this. You know, you could say something like, you know, every second person who comes here says the same thing to us. We really understand it's not easy to do. And guess what? You and I are now connected because you understand me, the widow. And so then if you say, you know what, I'll explain to you how we normally do this. And then you say, what if we pop into this room, or what if we sit down over here? I'll need to get you to fill in some papers and whatever. And if you're lucky enough to be able to say, can I make you a cup of tea? I'm not sure if, you know, you feel like one, and all that kind of stuff. And then we start the business. But transaction is second, empathy is first. And I reckon this is one of the most common opportunities we have, and we just miss it. So we get the angel, the halo, you know, comes with this. If we can just say something like that. This is another real life scenario that I got from a cemetery. Been to visit Dad's grave, it's all sunk. Mum's in the car there crying her eyes out. I've come to the front desk to complain and say, what a shock. You know, and they might even say, if you just know how much money we paid for that grave, you know, this sort of thing. So the person at the cemetery said, oh gosh, that happens all the time, we have heavy rain, and graves always collapse, but we'll get that onto our maintenance list today. The real scenario I got said it like this: we'll put your dad onto our maintenance list today. Hey, my dad's not a bit of maintenance. He's my vodka drinking buddy, remember? So don't make him a piece of maintenance. So you can imagine, that's a real, I didn't make this one up, it's a real story, that would get my not so happy face. So we'd rather someone said, that must have been really upsetting for both of you, because it's just as upsetting for the son, surely, to see your dad's grave like that. And then we have the magic words. Let me tell you what I can do. Let me tell you what I'm going to do about that today. Now, I know you can't go running out there now with a backhoe thing or shovels and a wheelbarrow of soil, and you might have a maintenance list and you might have 20 graves that have all collapsed, but you can still say, let me tell you what I can do for you today. And then you might say, you know, we'll make sure we attend to that. And one of the cemetery people said this to me. They said, you know what I'd do? I'd photograph it. When we'd levelled it, I'd photograph it and I'll say, and you know what, so that your mum doesn't have to worry, as soon as it's done, I'll take a photo, and if I may have your mobile phone number, I can send it to you today. Or we do have a lot of other graves that are also affected, and we're going to put that on our priority. You might say something like that. And as soon as we've done it, you know, it might be the next 24 hours, 48, you know, it can't always be. You can't overpromise and underdeliver. But I'll take a photo so that you don't need to worry your mum about it anymore. So that's empathy, because empathy is about actions as well as words. And I've got another one. So that's my smiley face one. One more. This is obviously a favourite one because I hear this all the time. You know how the plaque won't be ready for Christmas, plaque won't be ready for a birthday, won't be ready. And this was one of the most common responses I heard. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. That's number one. The suppliers are flat out just before Christmas, or they're flat out this time of the year. And you would have been told that when you ordered it. So, you know, it's my fault as well. Now, this is all about process. That is totally about process and procedure, but it's not about empathy. It might be the truth, but it says to me, you didn't hear a word I said. And so it gets my not so happy face. I can understand why you want, and use the person's name if they say, I've come in to get my son, you know, Jamie's plaque done, especially for a day that's so important like Mother's Day. Just let them know you hear them. You haven't fixed it yet. What could you do? Can I have a hand up? Someone saying, this is something we could do even if we can't get the plaque there. Yes? You could do a mock-up, exactly. And so that's why you need those magic words. but I'll tell you what I'm going to do about it. And you could say, I'm going to ring Arrow Bronze right now, or Evelyn, or where I'm going to ring them right now, and I'm just going to see where Jamie's plug is up to with them. We might be able to expedite it, but I can't promise just now. What I can do is take your details and ring you later when I've called them. Just the fact that you've made a call, even if you know it's going nowhere, when I get home and I get your call, don't promise me a call and not ring me. Give me a call and say, you know what, I rang them and we don't think we can promise it, but we can do this alternative or we can do that alternative, because I know, and then you reiterate, I know how special Mother's Day is going to be for you and your family. That's how you bring empathy into your conversation. And then my last one that I want to just use is this one here. Ground stuff. I want to tell you something. When I was doing this SEMCREM training, everyone said, you've got to train the frontline staff. And I said, let's train everybody, including the gardeners. And then, true story, one cemetery manager said to me, my gardeners will not want to come to any training where they have to sit in a chapel and listen to you. Well, thank you for the vote of confidence. But she said they won't want to come. She said they're people who do stuff. They couldn't sit still, and they're not frontliners. And anyway, they don't talk to grieving people. Oh, yes, they do. Would you agree? Oh, yes, they do. And this is the truth. The gardeners were my happiest people in the room. And they're saying, this is the first time anyone said we deserved training. And some of them said, I've never been told I'm allowed to approach a grieving person. I just do the lawns. Fancy, I've never been told I'm allowed to approach a grieving person. So let's say you've got your grieving person, you've got little old man, he's in his 80s, and he comes to the cemetery every Friday, and he brings his thermos and his scones with him, and sometimes he brings the paper and he reads the paper to whoever he visits, and he hangs out for about an hour or so, and you see him there, and he's sort of become a bit of everyone knows, the old codger who sits over there every Friday. And you're one of the grounds people. What do? You have options. Pretend not to see him. Just keep doing the whippersnippering, that's what you paid for. And people will say, I don't want to intrude into their grief. Here's a little tip for you. Just because you ask a person about their story, it's not an intrusion. That's your excuse to make yourself feel like, I'm really doing the right thing here. I'm not intruding. So I reckon that sort of stuff, and again, it's not offensive, it's not wrong, it just isn't maximising an opportunity to show that the people in the cemetery have got a heart. So you could say something like, hi, I'm John, I'm one of the gardeners here. I notice you come almost every week. Just wait for a little pause, and he might say, yep, have never missed a Friday for 3 years. And then here's your soft question. Is it okay if I ask who you come to visit? And let's say it's his wife. It could be his mother, could be his sister, or whatever. It could be one of his children that he comes to visit. Do you think he's going to say, get back to your whippersnippering and mind your own business? I reckon he's going to say, I visit Mary. We were married for 62 years, and sometimes I bring the Herald Sun and I read it to her. And I always have some scones because no one baked scones like my Mary did. These aren't as good, I just get them from the Beechworth Bakery. But she loves these. We always had scones and jam and cream at 10 o'clock every day. And so I come and I keep up the ritual. And before you know it, Mr. Gardner has had a conversation. It only took a few minutes. And for those of you who are cemetery managers and whatever thinking, we can't have all of our gardeners taking 2 or 3 minutes off talking to grieving people. Well, I think you want to rethink your processes because it's all about the customer. And this man, I absolutely tell you this with absolute confidence and truth. When I implemented this training in the cemeteries, I had feedback from the gardeners saying, you know what? People actually stop and talk to you. I had someone who thanked me about 3 times because I stopped and talked to him. And people were just saying, it makes you feel good. You actually feel good in yourself because you feel like you did a good deed for the day. Those staff have a spring in their step and they work twice as hard for you. They work twice as hard. So to finish up, this is what I want to say. Well, empathy for me is hearing the weight of my grief. And there are opportunities in all walks of life, including where you work, to hear the weight of someone's grief. Because I think many people are actually burdened and broken down by their grief. And just because they walk tall, it doesn't mean on the inside they're not carrying it around with them. And last of all, my take-home message is this idea of holding space. It's not about being touchy-feely. I hope you don't think, that's what we want you to be, because I don't want to be touchy-feely and I want you to be touchy-feely. But I want you to be with grieving people in a way that they say, he really understood where I was coming from. She really understood what I meant. And otherwise, I've just got this puddle of grief that they sit in all around them that nobody really wants to enter. And that's where their story, like Prince Harry's, remains untold. And that's where it becomes a burden. And that's where it does turn out to be mental illness for some people if they've got to carry their grief alone inside. Thank you. That's the end. We have about 3 minutes for questions. Anyone got any questions? Or you can find me outside. Yes.
Years ago, I was in Mexico on the Day of Death.
Yes.
Which is just continuing violence. Obviously, you're like the World Cup. All the families go to relatives' graves. They celebrate. They eat. They drink. With very marching bands. It's a day of celebration. 1 week off.
Yeah. Fabulous example. Thanks for sharing with that. And it normalises the whole thing around grief and death. And it says you can still celebrate them. You don't have to be mourning them. Wonderful. Thank you for that.